I think, workplace democracy is, well, sorry, now I've lost my train of thought. Um, sorry, so I think one of the things that people are very quick, workplace democracy advocates or co-op advocates in particular, are pretty quick to point out is that that there's there are all of these seeming benefits that people who work in co-ops like their workplace more, or that they sometimes people cite like higher wages, although I've seen kind of some studies that seem to go on both on both sides of these things. And so what I wonder is if this is true, right? One of the most common kind of retorts to people who don't support workplace democracy is to say, well, if there were all these benefits, I mean, that's what we have the free market for, right? Like if these things were so good and workers preferred these things, and they actually were more profitable and less likely to go under during economic downturns and these sorts of things, why haven't they just taken over? And why haven't they outcompeted capitalist firms?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 points there, right? Isn't there? So the first is to say that while I do think that worker democracy has some benefits, I think the safest thing you can say about it, based on the existing evidence, is that it doesn't have any clear drawbacks. So that's a slightly different way of phrasing it, right? So if you've got the political argument where you think that democracy and accountability in hierarchy are good things, it doesn't seem that there's any clear negative effects of implementing this model. Those don't seem to be borne out in the evidence, right? Now, there do seem to be some benefits as well. I do worry that advocates of worker co-ops sometimes exaggerate these, and we can get a little bit more into some of that evidence maybe in a bit. In response to your question, well, okay, if it has all these benefits, or if it's good enough at least, then why don't we see more of it? Well, I think there are quite a few different answers to that, but the most obvious one is this. Although it may be good for workers and good for society as a whole, it's not necessarily good for bosses, right? So there's no benefit to a capitalist or a shareholder, board or whatever, to implement worker democracy, because that's the workers are probably going to vote themselves a higher share of the output of the business, right? It's going to diminish the power of the people who are making the decisions. So why would they make the decision to change the company into a worker democracy there, unless they are, enlightened, which you get a couple of examples of that type of thing, right? But there's no reason for them to. They don't have an incentive to. So yeah, even if worker co-ops or worker democracy is better for the firm as a whole and for the workers, it may not be better for those in charge.
Does this, I think, does this explain why, for example, the only way to create a new worker co-op isn't just to, have a conventional firm that's then converted into a co-op, right? The other way would be like for a worker co-op to be started kind of whole cloth. And so, I think to the person who would be asking this question, right, would say that like, why haven't worker co-ops that have just sort of formed organically, right, where there's you don't require any bosses to consent to that, right?
Right. Sorry,
why haven't they sort of outcompeted? Why haven't they outcompeted existing firms?
Yeah, so why don't they enter the marketplace, right, and outcompete existing firms? So I think the answer is that it's actually very difficult for them to. One particular problem that worker co-ops have, and I'm using worker co-op and worker democracy kind of interchangeably here, even though they're strictly, worker co-op is kind of in the big category of worker democracy. But anyway, one problem they have is obtaining credit, right? And banks are just very reluctant to lend to worker co-ops. I think, again, for a kind of similar reason to the one I just gave you, right? They're not going to put investor interests first. They're going to put worker interests first. That's their whole thing. Another issue I think is, this argument is a very neoclassical argument, isn't it? Like, if it was so good, then the market would deliver it. Look, the simple fact is that a lot of people just don't know about worker democracy. Like it's not on their radar, right? In the same way that capitalism wasn't necessarily on the radar 500, 1,000 years ago. The kind of wage relation, the way we structure firms and work and markets now, those things weren't really widely known. worker democracy is just not something that people know about, and that applies to investors and banks, right, who are lending the credit. So again, they might be like, well, this is a form of business that I haven't really seen before, so it hasn't demonstrated that it can be successful. But also, there's the workers themselves might not think to create one, right? You have to. This is why I advocate, proper expansion of knowledge, spreading knowledge and awareness of worker democracy. I think that's a crucial part of activism, and that'll be a crucial part of expanding it, because people can't do what they don't know. Contrary to in the basic neoclassical model, people know everything, right?
Right. Okay. So I think that's the case. So what is the how do we get from here if the desired goal is a larger cooperative sector, however whatever share of the economy you think is desirable or want to have, what is it just about spreading awareness, or is it about building new institutions to support co-ops entering the market, or the conversion of existing firms into worker cooperatives? What sorts of things do we need to build to expand this sector?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things we can do. So yeah, you're right. Implicitly in your question is you don't want to limit it to like expanding awareness. That does sound kind of empty alone, although it is important. But there's these efforts like community wealth building, right? Which you may well have heard of, where communities, usually local communities, from the ground up, try to build up cooperative sectors, and that community wealth building encompasses a whole range of policies. We probably won't go into all of them here, but one of them is creating these co-ops, worker co-ops, as well as perhaps financial institutions that support them, like credit unions, for example. So these ground up efforts, I think, are a really big part of expanding the co-op sector, and that can lead by example and provide institutions for people to join up or emulate. So that's one way, the kind of ground up efforts. One question you had was, well, what about the more policy top down ones? Now one thing that I after looking at the evidence on worker democracy, I think before I'd really gone through it, if you'd asked me if we could pass a law that converted all businesses into worker co-ops or some form of worker democracy, if we could pass that law that did it, maybe over 5 or 10 years or whatever, I probably would have said yes, but I don't think I would now, because I'm not convinced that would be an effective policy, because people might just not be ready for it, and it could cause quite a lot of economic disruption. So I wouldn't want that degree of top-down policy. One thing I do advocate, and this isn't worker co-ops as such, but I do advocate having workers represented on corporate boards for large companies. So that would be like a more kind of top-down policy. I mean, it's still bottom-up in that it includes the workers, but a kind of legislated policy similar to the ones that they have in Germany and Finland and in a number of other like North and Central European countries. So those are two policies. I mean, there's lots more. There's things like tax incentives and ways of structuring co-ops that you can use, and they've been used to some degree in countries where you already have thriving cooperative sectors like Uruguay, for example. But there's really, I would attack it from all angles. There's a whole plethora of policies. Some are more top down, some are more bottom up.
So one thing I sort of wonder, you mentioned that prior to digging into the evidence, you would have been in support of basically a sort of wholesale conversion of the economy into worker co-ops, and now you're sort of less sure of that, at least in some like top down all at once kind of way. I mean, what's sort of in your sort of like vision, to the extent that you have like a vision of the future, or as a socialist, you want to pursue, worker ownership of the means of production and these sorts of things. How do co-ops fit into that? As opposed to, obviously, there are other ways to collectivize ownership of capital, right? Like you can have it owned at other levels than just the firm. You can have it owned at like the sector level, as is the case in the Meitner plan, or at the state level, as is the case, if you're talking about like state-owned enterprises or social wealth funds or these sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is that I am happy to say I don't really know what the
Mm,
eventual outcome would be. I'm not a massive fan of grand visions or kind of certainty about like what I would want the world to look like. I can say I'd like it to be more democratic. I can advocate these specific policies, right, which I think have been shown to various degrees to be effective. But I couldn't tell you like what percentage I think should be worker
okay.
co-ops, right? I think that's hopefully something that will be arrived at through the expansion of democracy and through the expansion of co-ops and other, I don't know,
Mm,
like government sponsored enterprises or government owned enterprises and consumer co-ops, right? And maybe there's room for conventional businesses in family owned businesses, family owned farms. To some degree, master apprentice kind of relationships in trades. There's a whole range of things. I mean, I'm a big fan
mm,
of Eleanor Ostrom, and she the economist, she was a political scientist by trade, but she won the economics Nobel Prize for work that was basically anthropology, investigating how people across the world, how local communities across the world manage resources. And she basically subscribed to this notion of polycentricity, which is a kind of fancy word for basically just saying there needs to be loads of different forms of governance. There needs to be loads of different ways of managing the economy, right? And so that is something that I buy into, and it's why I'm kind of more like let's institute these policies and see where it goes, rather
mm,
than here's the endpoint I want. I do think endpoints can be very dangerous.
mm.
I think there's a lot of history that attests to that. I don't want to have a kind of grand vision that I impose on the world, very suddenly with a very specific endpoint in mind.
Well, that's frustrating. That's a frustratingly sensible take. No, but I think I think pluralism is good, and obviously I know that's one of your sort of focuses here. Transitioning to a slightly different point, I was wondering, that when sort of we talk about like collectivizing capital, and worker co-ops are kind of a way of doing that. There's sort of oftentimes there's sort of two aspects to that, which sometimes are sort of treated as the same, and I don't know. I think it's maybe worth unpacking or considering separating the two sometimes, which is one aspect is changing how capital income is distributed, right? I mean, right now, capital income in a capitalist economy, which is like in the United States, like a third of national income, mainly flows to like a tiny number of people, right? And so, if you're like sort of an egalitarian-minded person, this seems obviously problematic. That's a huge amount of money. That's a huge amount of money that's just flowing to a small number of people. And then the other aspect is sort of like the decision making, how deciding how production happens. And so worker co-ops sort of take the worker co-op answer to this, right, is that okay, we're going to make the firm democratic, and also the capital income is going to flow back to the workers of that firm usually. And so I was wondering, if you had thoughts on sort of, do you see these two as sort of like necessarily having necessarily going together, like should they go together, or do you think they can be separated?
I actually think they can be separated. Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, this is an issue that I have thought about a lot, and it's one of the main limitations of worker democracy as I see it, because
Mm-hmm.
although the capital income will accrue to the workers within firms, there will still be massive inequality between firms. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt Bruenig is really good. I know that you subscribe to the immortal science of Bruenigism, right? In the Nordic model. I do too. I would say that someone like Matt Bruenig and James Medlock on the taxation side, as social democrats, they tend to emphasize distribution. They
Mm-hmm.
maybe neglect production, which is worker democracy and things. They might say they like it, but they won't necessarily go into as much depth on it. But they're very good on distribution. And worker democracy, because of interfirm inequality, will actually not necessarily solve inequality by itself. It might
Mm-hmm.
solve. It will help to solve. There's evidence that it solves inequality within firms, but you just get, like in Yugoslavia, for example, about which I know not too much, but enough about the levels of inequality between firms, because some industries are just so much more profitable than others, right? That's
Right.
and I guess you could make an argument about how that's markets, and I guess it is. I'm not sure what the alternative to markets is, to be honest. Maybe that's another conversation, but there's always going to be this inequality. And so I think you need redistribution, even if you had a kind of fully, say every organization, for the sake of argument, was a worker co-op or some form of worker democracy. You would need redistribution between regions as well. Mm-hmm. Crucially, I think regional inequality, if you've got, the high-tech car manufacturing in one region and then the raw materials are extracted in another region of a country, there's going to be inequality between those, even if they're worker owned internally, right? And that regional inequality is exactly the type of thing that leads to just people living completely different lives. It's really, I think, the best way to highlight regional inequality, and it leads to massive political and social fragmentation, like we've seen in the UK and the US, both of our countries. I think that's been a huge factor over the past decade or so, which has kind of shown its teeth, right? Has come home to roost, to keep using tired metaphors. Effectively, in a word, no, I don't think worker democracy is enough. And I think that those two things are basically separate and they need to be managed separately. And it's why, although I'm a kind of anarchist at heart, as you might be able to tell from my, political impetus towards some kind of democracy and against hierarchy, I do ultimately believe that there should be some kind of state that serves that redistributive role, because I don't, no, I mean, anarchists might say, yes, we can have it. The thing anarchists do, where they're like, yes, we can have it, but we won't call it the state. But it's like, okay, it's a state, right? so we need that kind of redistribution, I think.
Yeah, I think this is sort of you mentioned that sort of like the inequality between firms. I think this is something that you're right, that Matt Brunig has talked about, and one of the things he points out as well is that like the sort of the boundary, the firm boundary, is in some sense kind of sort of completely arbitrary. Like if you imagine a very capital intensive firm, sort of contracting out some service to some labor intensive service. So you can imagine, like, I think the example that's used is like Google contracting out their like food service workers for the cafeteria they have on their huge campus. And so this is sort of an arbitrary distinction between, does Google contract out to this service worker company, or are those service workers employees at the Google corporation? In some sense, this is sort of arbitrary, but in a world where capital income is flowing, basically only flows back to the workers at a given firm, that makes a huge difference in terms of the amount of money going to the people at tech workers at Google versus the sort of food service workers, right? Because tech workers are getting all of Google's capital income and the food service workers aren't getting any, whereas if they were employees, then they would be getting some, that capital income. So I think this is kind of a big problem. I know that some there's some sort of proposals. I don't know if you've ever read David Schweikart's book After Capitalism.
No, I haven't.
He sort of outlines a kind of a market socialist model that's co-op based, and his sort of solution to this is a capital assets tax on firms, basically. Which then would be redistributed. It sort of approximates a social wealth fund in that way. But in either case, that this is sort of neither here nor there. I suppose the other concern I think I would have about a sort of co-op based model is sort of related here, which is this notion of diversification. So if the idea is so you mentioned in the video that you did on workplace democracy, which anyone listening to this interview has not watched, they should. You mentioned that oftentimes, and this is a common practice, that you sort of have to like pay some upfront money when you join a co-op, right? Some co-ops, I think, will just like take a little bit off your wages for a given time until you're a full member if you don't have the capital up initially, or there are various ways to do this. But in essence, what this kind of means is it means that like this is an investment, right? You're putting money into this firm, and if that firm goes under, not only have you lost your job, right, you've also lost like your initial contribution, a pretty potentially a pretty large investment. And so, I mean, I was wondering, what you kind of think about this, potential objection to co-ops and sort of capital ownership at the firm level.
Sorry. Yeah. So it is. No. So I mean, I agree with it to an extent. I mean, it does depend on the financing model, right? Mm-hmm. It's not always the case that every worker co-op has to finance itself that way, right? You might be able to finance yourself through banks or credit unions or whatever method you use. They could receive kind of government funding, whether like local or federal. So there are other ways that you can have different arrangements where you've got various types of shareholders that maybe don't have voting rights in the same way as like traditional shareholders. So there are other ways of doing it, and I would be a big advocate of those, precisely because of what you just said, right? You put your money into this and it goes under and you lose your job and your money. I will say one thing, which is that worker co-ops are much better at weathering recessions. Although that's true, the chance that they will go under in the first place is really much reduced. They tend to protect jobs and kind of temporarily cut pay and then bring it back up. So they do have that advantage. But yeah, I mean, it's a point well taken. And that's why you need a welfare state, right? I mean, you mentioned a social wealth fund. Maybe that is one solution. A capital assets tax. I haven't thought about that and how that would work, to be honest. It sounds like potentially an interesting idea, but worker democracy brings with it some issues as well as benefits, right? And that is one of them. I mean, the other issue with what you were just talking about, the financing, is that obviously poorer people can't do it, right? So right. You can join this worker co-op, but you have to front 20 grand. Who's going to be able to do that? Like the stereotype of the type of people who make co-ops, right? Like kind of middle class, left wing hippies right. And stuff like that's because that's what you often get now. So we really need to have alternative financing models, but also like a strong redistributive state as well, right?
Yeah. So the other thing I think that is a common question about worker co-ops and I guess really any kind of workplace democracy is sort of what the workplace democracy is kind of a way. It's a way of giving internal power, workers power to workers internal to the firm, and another way of giving. That we give power to workers within a firm, aside from co-determination or worker ownership or these sorts of things, is is unions. And so I think there's sort of the question of in a worker co-op, does unionization even make sense? So so I was wondering how you think the sort of intersection between these two, between things like co-determination or worker ownership and unionization are.
Yeah, I think again, it's one of these things where if you'd asked me about 6 months ago, I would have said, well, worker ownership basically makes unions irrelevant because they're in control, right? So why do they need to unionize? And it's possible that makes sense at a very low level, with you got like, I don't know, 6 people and they're all kind of vote on everything, and you got that proper participatory democracy in a small scale. But on a larger scale, and we see this with political democracy, right? You still get a detachment between the people, the elected and the electorate, right? You still might get a managerial class, and that's been played out in Mondragon in Spain. You have this elected class, you have a whole Congress, and workers do seem to think that they're separate. They're kind of like a separate class, and I think that was the case in Yugoslavia as well, from what I know. So my point is to say that actually unions may still be necessary even under worker democracy, especially in the large corporations. And Mondragon has actually banned unions, more or less, or at least there are certain clauses in certain places. I'm not sure of the ins and outs of it, but basically, if you join, you're not allowed to be in a union. I'm not sure if that's 100% universal there, but it's definitely a policy that they've had. So it seems that basically, it's like that meme. Why not both? I honestly really see them as as complementary. Essentially, I don't see it as an either or situation at all. I mean, there's one other question implicit, which is like, will unions be able to do enough alone? Why not just unions, right?
Right.
I guess that's one other question. And if somebody could persuade me that unions would do the job, then I would kind of be very happy, because that's actually an easier policy to advocate. But I don't think that unions, they don't have the direct control. I mean, the union manager boss relationship is adversarial, right? It's like, it's bargaining, it's negotiation. What you need, and I think this is part of the economic argument for worker democracy, right, going back to the beginning, is having workers actually making the decisions as part of the firm, and they can bring a lot of knowledge to that process. As well as kind of being represented directly, not just across the negotiating board when you're battling and threatening to strike, but actually in the everyday decisions. There's a democratic argument for that, but there's also an economic argument, because workers know the firm much better than bosses do. And there's a lot, it does just seem in a lot of cases that bosses don't really understand their firms. I mean, who can, especially a large one, but even a small one, who can understand like a massive organization that has, interacts with loads of different suppliers, has loads and loads of different levels of hierarchy, right? There'll be parts of the organization that the bosses don't even know about or understand, and the workers can help, hopefully, to bring that knowledge in a way that I don't think unions do, just because of their role, because of their adversarial role. I don't think they work quite the same way. So that's why I want both, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why more capitalists don't just read Hayek and become socialists.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I didn't reference Hayek explicitly, but that's it. It's localized knowledge, right? It's what Hayek said. I was very influenced by an economist called Chris Dillow. I don't know if you know him. He writes the blog called Stumbling and Mumbling. He's a very old blogger, by which I mean he's been blogging for a while. Not that he's old, but I think he's been doing it for the best part of 20 years. So, but he's a kind of financier, but a Marxist, and he's a market socialist. And he was the first person I saw who used Hayek's argument to argue for worker democracy, that you need to assimilate and harness local knowledge by having the workers have a say, the local knowledge that workers have of their everyday tasks, the type of thing that bosses won't know and can't know, that type of stuff. So that was all credit to Chris Dillow for, I don't know if he's the first person to make that argument, but it was certainly the first person I saw. So yeah, I used it in my video that you referenced earlier.
Yeah, I mean, it's very funny, kind of, sort of trollish argument, but also, not trollish because it's wrong.
It's the best type of argument. Like, slightly is also a troll, right? Like a very serious and hopefully sound argument, but also trolls the other side a little bit. But that's hopefully, I think, how you kind of extend an olive branch. You're like, oh well, Hayek, I think, had a really good point about local knowledge. I mean, he did, right? It was, I think that's a great essay, the use of knowledge in society. But have you considered applying it in this way, right? And then hopefully that's more kind of rhetorically useful as well as being sensible on it in itself.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, relating back to the unionization question is the other, a potential role, kind of role that I would see for unions as well, would be sector level unions, who could enact things like like solidaristic wage policies to sort of reduce disparities in wage inequality, not just within the firm, which workplace democracy often does or seems to, but sort of across firms, right? So this was like part of the Ryan Meidner model, where they had the solidaristic wage policy where you would make it so that workers within doing a particular job across firms would you'd compress wages even across like sort of like highly productive workers, within the sort of the same industry. This had some benefits of like, one thing was that it sort of selected out for more productive firms, because it meant that firms that were less productive, had to pay. They couldn't get by just paying their workers less. They sort of had to, pay them some floor, and then it also kind of limited wage inequality by compressing. That's maybe another area.
Well, no, I think it does go back to what we were just talking about, right? Because we were talking about the inadequacy of worker democracy to address things like the distribution of wealth across a whole country or across the world, right? Because of regional or industry differences. So sectoral unions, they're another way of doing that, right? As well as taxes, having unions across the sector try to equalize pay for workers in different firms and increase solidarity between them, right? As well, so they don't. So the Google service workers from your example, and the I forget what the service workers and the workers within Google who work in the office, right? If they had some kind of mechanism that brought them together through unions, then they might not feel at loggerheads, and they might negotiate for pay in combination with each other. So that type of thing, is one way of addressing the problem. And again, it speaks to the notion of like polycentricity, right? We need so many different organizations and institutions to achieve like a fair and egalitarian society. There's no neat solution. We have to keep thinking of things, and there's no reason. Sectoral unions I'm a big fan of. They also have more bargaining power as well, right, compared to like a one union at one firm. So right. Absolutely, I agree with you. I'm all for sectoral unions.
So this is maybe again, this is sort of a slight tangent, but one thing that we sort of, I think, talked about throughout this interview is we sort of talked about democracy and sort of left it as sort of like that this is unquestionably that this is like a good thing, right? Sort of taking it as a given. But obviously, there's a lot of people who, well, at least they might pay some kind of lip service to like, democracy, liberal democracy is good and these sorts of things. But I mean, I wonder if it's worth. I'd like to hear, sort of why you think democracy is good, right? Like, what is it about? Why that's something that you think is so good that it's so good that you don't just want it in government, that you also want it, to bring it into the firm in the first place. Like, what is it about? Why do you support democracy? I guess.
It's a big question. Nobody really asks that question. You often get away with just saying I support democracy, and everyone kind of nods their head because they think they do as well. But I mean, the first thing is that it allows you to kick the bastards out, right? As we would say in the UK. So anyone who is abusing their power, anyone who is not doing a good job in charge, you would hope, at least in abstract, that democracy provides a mechanism by which to remove them without, revolution, war, violence. It provides a peaceful mechanism by which to do that. So I think that's one big benefit of democracy. I think it also, it helps to create a kind of population that's engaged with what's going on around them. And I know that we do have increasing levels of political disenfranchisement, and we can get to, if you want to get into some of the issues with current, representative democracy, if you want. But it creates a kind of a citizenry, right, who are hopefully engaged with the world around them and engaged with their fellow citizens. This is what I said about having workers on boards, right? It hopefully tries to harness this local knowledge. People who are from a particular region, a particular class, a particular race are going to have a certain perspective. And it's true. Perhaps it's inevitable. I might hope not. But it seems to be the norm of history up until now that rulers, whether democratically elected or not, do tend to come from more privileged backgrounds, right? And so democracy provides a way for people to say, from underprivileged backgrounds, to say, look at us, look at this. Our life is completely different to yours, right? Here's what's going on away from London, away from Washington. So those are my three reasons, really. So yeah, you can kick the bastards out. It creates a politically engaged citizenry, and it hopefully harnesses local knowledge and represents people's interests who wouldn't necessarily be represented by rulers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great answer. Um, and so, one of the an alternative method that we've sort of alluded to again to the interview, but I don't think I've ever quite drilled down on, is bringing an alternative method of bringing democracy into the workplace. I mean, is co-determination, right? So this is where the workers don't own the firm, but they have some, they're allotted some number of seats on the corporate board. Usually, I think, for example, in Germany, it's any firm over some number of employees. I think it's
500.
500. Yeah. Okay. 500 employees has to have a third of the board be workers. So I was wondering if you could maybe sort of compare and contrast this to sort of like a full worker ownership. What you think the strengths and weaknesses are of co-determination. These sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. I mean, my view of co-determination is that it is essentially a compromise. It's a compromise from a fully worker-owned firm, but it's a compromise that's made for good reason. One is for reasons of political expediency. Saying the workers should take over all existing corporations entirely is a bit of a political non-starter. I think worker representation on boards is more feasible, especially since it already exists in so many countries, as you mentioned. But I do actually think that there's what you could call an economic argument for it, because ultimately, as an anarchist at heart, again, participatory democracy is the ideal for me. And basically having a kind of horizontal structure where everybody is able to voice their considerations and everybody is able to make decisions, hopefully by consensus. At the very least by majority, right? And I've been part of organizations that have worked that way. And the problem is that you can't do it with more than about 10 people. You simply cannot. And we live in a world with a lot of people in it. We live in a world that's hugely interconnected. We live in a world that has large organizations which benefit from economies of scale, right? And so the idea of having, organizations of 10 to 12 people littered around the place, I just think is a bit of a non-starter. And so what you move to more indirect mechanisms, right? You can't have consensus decision making at any real scale. We couldn't have government by consensus decision making. It's completely absurd. You can't have a big population, even in a relatively small country, whether in, the UK, the USA or Liechtenstein, you can't have a consensus among the populace. So you have to move to more representative forms of democracy. And I think that worker co-determination on boards is one way of doing that, of dealing with the scale, the complexity of modern economies, of modern corporations, while still giving workers a voice and a seat at the table. I will say that I don't think that a third of workers on the board is enough. I think it should be at least 50%, maybe 51%. Workers should have, at least as many seats on the board as capital. So I do advocate an expansion of worker co-determination so that workers are the ones with at least an equal say in matters. Because I know that if you look at some of the research on this, and again, I went into this on my video, currently there may be some benefits to it, but I think it's perceived as a slightly superficial policy by the workers where they actually don't really have a say. Because ultimately, when push comes to shove, right, and you're majority voting, all the workers say, no, we don't want to scrap that plant and get rid of all those people. But then all the shareholders can say, well, yes, we do. And they've got a majority vote, right? So, yeah, it's a compromise, both with politics, as it exists right now, but also I think with the idea of having a fully functioning modern economy. I can't see any more direct democracy really at that scale working very well. And I think one of the problems with Mondragon is that they kind of pretended that they had that for a long time, and then it morphed into something even worse than than it would have been if they'd actively embraced a more representative democratic model.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this sort of interesting tension between, so we were talking before about the Hayekian kind of argument, the sort of local knowledge argument. That's why you want to get input from the workers and these sorts of things. But on the other hand, like it can be difficult to, administratively to get that input, and
Yeah.
not just that, right? Like one of the, it's like this is one of the critiques. I think I remember Pericon being on your reading list. So have you read that book?
I haven't read Paricon.
Okay.
No, I don't think it is on there. But yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I must be misremembering. But in either case,
I'm aware of it though.
Yeah. So like this sort of, I think, is one of the sort of quintessential examples of, a model that seems to me to just be like a hell of meeting after meeting, and like I don't think anyone wants to spend their lives in meetings all the time. And so this is another critique I think you often hear about workplace democracy, is that like is that how do you strike this balance between getting input from workers, giving workers control over their workplace, but not making it so everyone, there's a meeting every day, there's a meeting every day, and we have to take a vote on, every decision that we make and these sorts of things. I think it's sort of difficult to, come up with a balance here, and maybe co-determination is part of that. I don't know. This is a question that I don't feel like I have like a concrete answer to. I'm not sure there is a concrete answer.
No, I don't think there is. But it's you're absolutely right. Let's vote on whether we're going to buy a new stapler is hell. And as I said, I've been in consensus decision-making groups. It can be long. It can be tedious. I mean, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said the trouble with socialism is that it would take up too many evenings. Right. And we don't want to take up too many of people's evenings, right? I mean, part of it, this is all about work and worker democracy, right? I think part of socialism and leftism and progressivism, or whatever you want to call it, in the future will be about reducing work hours. That's another policy that I kind of advocate, right? So, you don't want people to have to attend all of these meetings and vote on everything. You don't want them to, have to take on the cognitive load, right? We call it, of managing the workplace so much that they take it home with them, right? But that's why you have elected managers, right, as opposed to consensus decision making. And you're right, worker co-determination is one such policy. If you want to be on the board, if you want to take on that burden, then you can run for office. If you don't, then you don't have to, but you can vote once a year or something. I think people do really value being able to switch off. I think people obviously really value their free time, and we don't want to impose on them a model of socialism where we're just constantly bickering and meeting about everything, and splitting like the kind of Monty Python sketch and stuff like that. Because I think that's people's kind of caricature of socialism, and but I can understand why they think like that.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of a kind of an interesting. You mentioned like policies that get people to work less, right? That reduce working hours. There's sort of Matt Burnett kind of has a funny, funny kind of argument relating to that, which is that like in the same way that like a social wealth fund is a way to sort of incrementally collectivize capital, a lot of maybe more of like leftists of a kind of like Marxist persuasion or something will say, well, market socialism, you're still like commodifying people's lives, right? Like you're still people's labor is still being treated as a commodity. Well, there's an incremental kind of solution to that too, which is every hour that people aren't working is an hour less of their life that's being decommodified, right? And so the sort of a solution there is to make people work less and less and give them more leisure time, which I think is absolutely a wonderful thing. Just to sort of tie a sort of a neat bow on this conversation, which I think has been an amazing one. We sort of end like all of our interviews with the same question, which is if you could like beam a piece of unlearning economics thought into, perhaps the public, or perhaps, people in the economics profession, or, you can sort of take this question how you want. What would be that sort of maxim of unlearning economics thought that you'd beam out into the world?
It would have to be the idea that the economy and social aims are not opposed to each other, because I think that you see far too much rhetoric around, we need to do this because it's good for the economy. We need to cut wages, we need to cut public services, we need to reduce government debt, all of these things where it seems like the economy is some kind of hard truth that's out there, and we can't do things that are good for people. We can't implement a minimum wage because don't you know how the economy works, and the economy is going to suffer, and there's going to be some other consequence down the line. Sometimes that's true, don't get me wrong, right? You have to look at the evidence, you have to see whether it's true or not. It can be true, but there's no reason to suppose that it's always true. And I think you said about the economics profession and you said about the public, I think this applies to both of them, perhaps in slightly different ways. But, you see this kind of view where the economy and humanity are almost odds, right? They're almost at loggerheads. You can't, doing something for one will take away from the other. So the idea that, that doesn't always have to be the case, I think would be the main thing,
Yeah, well, I think that'd be an excellent. The world would be much better, if that thought were indeed beamed out.
Hopefully.
So in either case, thank you so much for coming on. If there's anything you want to plug, feel free to do so now.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. My YouTube channel is Unlearning Economics. I also stream now, so I do conversations like this on my channel too. Maybe I'll have you guys on one day, and I play Elden Ring pretty badly as well on my stream sometimes. So, if you like watching me die 50 times to a boss before finally beating it, then, come and check it out.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on. And this has been the interview.